Hi, I'm Doyle.
And I'm Jordan, and I got something to say. So we're gonna pick up a little bit more from our last couple of podcasts, which were about agenda, narrative, and framing, and kind of extend that into how and why I think those are useful tools in kind of forming popular opinion, or maybe I should say swaying popular opinion, because that's truly what they're used for at scale. Um, in society today, for better or for worse. And we could talk about that as well if we get to it. If not in this episode, maybe in the next. But what I really want to start with is talking about how those modes of operation, having an overarching driving agenda, informing a narrative of, stories that fit together to that larger agenda meta narrative, and presenting them through different framing of facts, right? So what happens is the facts of a situation are framed in a certain way to paint a narrative that supports an agenda. And that doesn't matter what the agenda is, doesn't matter who it is. Everybody, when they communicate, that's how it breaks down, because that's how we interact with each other. And it's one thing for that to happen on an individual level, or like a few people to a few people, or one person to a few people, but it becomes something very different when it's, a few people to 50% of the population, or one person to 20% of the population. When it becomes to those level, or it comes to those levels, that's a bigger lever to leverage people and behavior and motivation than just the one-on-one or a few to a few. And that's, I think, where we fall into places in society where we get ourselves into real big problems in a lot of different ways. And that truly is the root of the issue that most people try to pin on, like social media, or new technology, or back in the day TV, or back in the day radio, or more back in the
Back
day
in the day, yeah.
printing. What do you say?
I said,
Well,
whoa, back in the day, TV. No, I mean,
I mean, but
I
seriously,
understand why
right?
you're saying that. Yeah.
Or more back in the day, the printing press. More back in the day, writing, actual writing, and not oration. And probably even back before then, oration versus
Sure.
signaling, right? Um, so that's always been the case, is that new technologies get demonized, just literally demonized, right? That, oh, that's of the devil, that's Satan's stuff, right? Um, like, so, I mean, and there's reasons why we use these words for things, right? It's not just because like it's came from nowhere, but and that's actually part of the whole deal too, right? That's part of framing, right? Framing this new
Hmm.
technology as part of the devil, so you stay away from it, because that supports the ultimate agenda of stopping progress, right? We can get into the detailed discussion about that at another stage, but I want to talk about why those levers work, because it's important to understand that. And once you understand that and truly internalize that understanding, I think it will change. It changes people's lives when they really come to that realization. Um, and part of I think there's two major contributing factors. And Doyle, if you have some others that you'd like to add, and certainly I know you'll want to add your perspective and color on these two. I want to hear that for sure. Um, but I think the two primary reasons why that works is that, one, I think the biggest one is the safety in numbers argument, that, we as social evolved beings understand that at our core, at a very deep level, we understand that we cannot survive on our own. I mean, yeah, you probably could, but it'd be very hard. I mean, some people do it, right? I mean, you look at like people who go way out in the wilderness, off the grid, in a cabin that they built by themselves. They can do it, but it is very, very, very hard. And you could say, well, I could just be by myself and like order everything on the internet and blah, blah. That's not being by yourself, right? You're dependent on so many people
Right.
and so many different things. Like, what happens if your internet goes out? What are you gonna do, right? I mean, or what happens if UPS or whoever doesn't deliver to you, right? What are you gonna do? So it's like that. That's a silly argument that's
Right.
living on your own. So we know instinctively at a deep level that the more people we can ally ourselves with and have that reciprocity of support and protection with, the stronger we are, or the more stable we are for the long term. Of course, there's a trade-off with that about autonomy and freedom, but I don't.
Yep.
That's a completely different topic to talk about.
Well, there's discussion points to be had before we get that far with that
Mm-hmm.
topic too. I mean, just inside the dynamics of the human interaction in this social groups. So yeah, go ahead. I just
Yeah,
I think there's a lot to be had there.
no doubt about that. And I think the other, so that I think that's the primary uh, driver of those levers, why they work. Using
Mhm.
framing to support this narrative and ultimately support an agenda, is because that framing can be used to basically instill fear. But I mean, you don't even have to couch it so dramatically. It's really to indicate that there is a group here that feels this way, and if you're part of that in group, you can be protected. If you're not part of the in group, you are not just going to be excluded. You're going to be um, um, hmm,
You'll be
attacked is not the right
outside the
word.
circle.
Yeah,
Well,
what's
you'll
that?
just be outside the circle. And
Right.
attack is an aggressive, outcome as possible. But even lesser than that, it's just that you're not part of us.
You're not safe, right?
And
If you're in this
right,
group,
and
you're
that
safe. If you're not in this group, you're not safe. Period.
well, even that's just an implication, right?
That's fair.
That you're not safe. So really, it's really the connection. It's
You're
you're
right.
part of us, as you said. You're part of the group. So all the things that entails, that means, and the implications are you're safe. We will protect you. You're one of us, and so we think alike, we act alike, we are alike.
Yeah.
Whatever and on whatever those threads of similarity are. But I think that's where I was heading this moment ago. And since I've interrupted, I'll go ahead
Yeah,
and run for a
please.
moment. Again, in our past discussions, I've mentioned that part of my undergraduate studies was in sociology. It was a criminal justice degree with a sociology minor. I actually took more sociology and psychology than I did criminal justice. Makes sense because criminal justice is purely founded on the social sciences to a great extent, and the law, which is a different angle, but from the criminal justice perspective. But one of the things that really resonated with me, and I've leaned on this a lot over the years, is the social psychology. Right, because people go, you study sociology, it's all about the behavior of groups and the things that are related to that, and then psychology is the study of human behavior and humor and human existence and being and things of that sort. But when you put them together, that's when the picture starts to make some sense. At least it did to me. It's social psychology is all about how the individual is and exists and interacts and behaves within the group. Right? Most individuals want to be unique, right? To some extent, but only to and this varies, right? Some individuals want to be totally unique, totally different, regardless. They want to be anti anything else that's mainstream. Granted, and sometimes it can become a mission in and of itself. Sometimes it is the natural tendency, right? It's the person that's who they are at their core, who they believe they are at their core, and it's not that they're antisocial. It's a choice. But even then, it becomes a balance of that individuality and that uniqueness in the context of the greater group
Yep.
and all the things that it means to be part of a group. And I'll give you, for instance, right? You have your nuclear family, right? And then that's a group that one chooses to be in. Then you have your biological family, and that's not one you necessarily choose to, at least not at birth, to be a part of, but you're a part of that by definition. And then there's your various social groups and other types of groups that occur over time. And there are those interactions. At your core, you're who you are. but you're still needing this other connection, this other piece of the puzzle, if you will. And going back to what you said about someone that goes and lives off the grid and builds their cabin all by themselves and all that, that's a rare individual. And quite frankly, I would suggest that they are having less of a life. They may want that; it's their choice, but they have a less of a life for if nothing else, because of the things that do get offered up and that do come and emanate from being part of a group.
Yeah.
Right. The social interaction, right? Because we know that our psyche thrives on various kinds of social interaction, and flourishes because of that. But we also know that if you take a child and pull them away from social interaction, they will, and it's been scientifically proven, that they will not thrive. A newborn child that isn't socialized by the parents, isn't held, isn't loved, isn't talked to, that does not thrive. Physically does not thrive. So there's that dynamic there. Anyway, it's really intriguing to me because what we talked about what we've been talking about are the science or the sciences or the social sciences behind individuals and groups. And I think what we've been dancing around or kind of moving toward a little bit is there's the natural use of all of that interaction. There's the natural use of people, because you start talking about how does a group get formed. Typically, it's one individual and another individual choose, or come together for some reason, and then from there, then they create the dynamics of the group that then extend and then attract and draw others, that may have similar needs, or it could be happenstance, right? It could be just because someone interacted, met someone.
Well, it's like communities, right? Like it just happened to be in the same location.
Right. And it wasn't necessarily intentional, but it was by default or de facto circumstances. Then you start getting into people that see this and then begin to try to leverage it. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's sort of where we've been kind of leaning and kind of looking kind of down the road just a little bit to talk about, because I think that's the part that is most concerning in my mind right now, because while there are a lot of great and honorable and productive and positive kinds of reasons and rationale for the agenda of the group, right, and the framing and all that emanate from that, it can be manipulated.
Sure.
Right, and people want to support the group, and within the group, talking about the individual aspects, the individual psychology inside the group, there are roles within groups, right? There are leaders that arise out of either by default, and an example of that might be when I was on a jury. It was a murder trial, and I was on the jury. And the jury, when we were given the case to deliberate, it was chaos for a minute, right? And we first order of business was to elect a foreman of the jury to be the one to help coordinate and facilitate, and no one wanted to do it. And then yours truly kind of said, okay, let's get some order here and let's try to figure out. And after about 2 minutes of talking, they all said, you need to be the foreman, right? And so there's that natural kind of thing that where people get to be a leader, but then there's also those that go in and seize the leader. They want to be that role, and there's then the others are varying degrees of followers. Well, when someone is a leader, either by seizing it or by election of the group, they have influence, right? By virtue of the group. To your point, you alluded earlier to about individual freedoms, and I think this is an example of where inside the group dynamic, people potentially sacrifice some of their individual freedoms for what they perceive to be the greater good of that group.
I don't think I think potentially is too weak of a word. I think definitely they do. Right now, it may not be a significant amount of freedom at all.
Right.
But you're not part of the group if you don't. That's kind of like a tantamount to the definition of the group, that you are sacrificing some of your autonomy and personal freedom to belong to the group. It's the sacrifice. Agree. It's the payment to be in the group.
Yeah. right? Is the dues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because you can't be if you can't support the group, you can't be in the you're really not in the group. You may be affiliated, but you're not quote unquote in the group.
Right.
But yeah, that's a great clarification on that. It is a definite surrender of some of your rights, and they may be small, and it may be very limited in scope. But then again, it might be large in scope, depending
Right. Or
upon
it could be things you don't care about anyway, right? That you
Sure.
some rights you don't exercise.
Right. And so when you think about that, then there's this risk and of a leader. There's a positive risk and a negative risk, right? The positive risk is the leader takes it upon him or herself to guide the group at their own will, but it's for the betterment of the group, right? And then there's the other side of the leader chooses or elects to guide the group for their own personal benefit,
Right.
and at the cost of the group, right? And those are two extremes, but I mean, I think they sort of demonstrate sort of the dichotomy of the potential good and the potential negative risks associated with leaders in a group. And the positive is easier to go, okay, well that's okay if they're always going to do it for selflessly and for the betterment of the group, for the benefit of the group. That we've seen leaders like that, right? That we've seen leaders all throughout history that at least appear from all of their behavior, because we never get inside anyone's head. We see from their behaviors that what they did was selfless. I think in terms of like Joan of Arc, right? The little, what was she, 14 or 15 or 16-year-old in France. That obviously that young child who was an adult, a mature beyond her years, led an uprising and a rebellion, and the people, the suppressed people, and that's amazing to think that someone did that and basically sacrificed her life. Or I say sacrificed. It cost her life to do what she did, and she had to have been motivated by doing for the group, and being the French people. And beyond that, I mean, there are other examples. That was one that just popped into my head. Gandhi. Yeah, and there's a number, especially, and it's harder to find as many today, right? Partly because we're probably so close. History has not dampened some of the noise around things, so that the true. I mean, I think Martin Luther King is probably one of the more recent ones that I think that history is clear enough that was a great selfless mind and leader. But there are others, even beyond him. Today, I think would struggle to name one above all the others, or even some potentially above all the others. But there are those that we believe.
I think there's a distinction here that needs to be, and it's not even a distinction. I think there's a clarification that needs to be made here, in that you're restricting your assessment to public leaders. Those aren't our only leaders.
That's right. That's right.
We have vastly more private leaders than we have public leaders, and I can guarantee you. You look at human nature. I can guarantee you there are countless fully selfless leaders leading organizations, whether that be a business, whether that be a religious organization, whether that just be a group of friends in a neighborhood that rotate potluck dinners at their homes or whatever. I mean, there's people that lead those things, and that's people want to downplay the importance of that kind of stuff, but those are the most critically important things, because that's what helps us understand and hold on to our humanity.
Absolutely. I'm glad you called that out, because I was inadvertently going down the path of the universally visible versus those that are behind the scenes, which selfless leaders tend to be not visible anyway, for the most part. To your point, right? They do without searching for rewards. And so I think your point is very, very valid and accurate, that there are probably many more than I was seeming to say.
Now, public leaders, you probably have a point.
Right. No, I agree with that. I still stand by that. But anyway, so the other side of that coin is there are those that have somehow in some groups sought to, selfishly, guide the group as the leader, either through self-appointment or a coup, or even if they were elected, right, through, just the natural course of, when I say elected, I don't mean necessarily by a formal, vote cast, but there can be default de facto leaders by people following, right? Because I have my simplest definition of a leader is somebody that's got someone following them.
Well, that's certainly an election, right? Because they're voting by actually doing the following.
Right. That's my point. It's the election is by behavior and not by casting of lots or casting of votes or whatever the method that some groups have. Right. So anyway, I think the risk or not the risk, the point of concern about this topic here of the strength in numbers, or the safety in numbers rather, is that can also be the lack of safety in numbers, because of the risks that the leader introduces by his or her potential selfish behavior. Right.
Sure.
I mean, we've seen publicly a number of those where there have been tragic consequences of a leader doing things selfishly at the expense and cost and life many times of the followers.
Of course.
I won't name any right now because that could get into a real controversial set of.
Oh, it's easy to name one.
But
It's not controversial at all. Hitler,
sure. Right.
I mean, if that's controversial, then come at me, bro.
No,
it's like
no. I was thinking not quite that epic.
Yeah, I feel you. I think additionally, though, another thing to add to your point about the risk that of the leaders, acting out of their own ends, and not even 100% out of their own ends, right? If or needs or desires, maybe even if it's only like 50-50, it still can be unacceptably perverse in that sense. But the other aspect of that, and I think this is actually the more dangerous and insidious aspect, is that the people who join any sort of group give up more rights than they understand that they give up. And an additional risk is that once in a group, the rights that you give up are expanded, meaning that you have to give up more rights to continue to be in the group. That is the real danger point to me, because especially when that group is not something you can get out of, right? It's like, what are you supposed to do then? You have no choice. And then at that point, it's just a matter of time before you literally become a slave to the group. And that is very problematic. And people want to say, "Oh, you're arguing slippery slope." It's like, no, it's called proof in the fact of history. It's not. I'm arguing a hypothetical. I'm arguing that the same thing that's literally always happened will continue and happen again. You have to prove that it's not going to happen again when you have, like, it's anecdotal. Okay, sure. When it's 100% of anecdotes, it's something beyond just anecdotal. It's truth at that point. Right. And I think that's a real risk with groups. But they're necessary. I'm not saying that means we shouldn't have groups. I mean, I'm just saying that especially the larger and the more powerful a group is, the more susceptible they are to that sort of a thing.
Right. I think you hit the spot right there. Is there's got to be this balance of the group and the individual. Once that balance is out of kilter either way, right? I mean, typically there's less risk when it's one individual out of balance with the group. They can just be ostracized from the group. They can be disbanded or disjoined with the group.
I see it differently, because at that point that's still 100% risk for that individual. And
it is for the individual,
right? Yeah. But the point of it, my position is, and this is definitely not speaking objectively, right? This is subjectively my point of view, is that any group that operates under the parameters that it's okay just to ostracize the one person because of that, I think that that's fine for them to operate that way. I think that's why there has to be extreme limits on the power and control and scope that those groups have. Because if we don't, then it's not okay to do that. You see what I'm saying? It's like one or the other. Either you have to keep that scope constrained on those groups, or they can't exercise the power of ostracization in that manner. It's too dangerous.
I, agreed. But then that means that the balance is not there between the group and the individual. That's sort of my point, right? That if the group is out of balance in its favor, then that's what you just described. If it's out of balance in the other favor, if the individual says, no, I'm not going to be part of this, I'm not part of this any longer, they have the power to get out. That's sort of where.
But that's different than ostracization, right? That's voluntary choice.
Granted.
Yeah.
Granted, but my point is if as part of the group, I am not supporting the group, but I am not pulling out of the group. I'm not exercising that power. That's where the conflict can come from, right? Because the individual is not pulling out.
Only
well, you think in terms of
there's only one way that's possible. The incentives are wrong in the group. Here's my point: is that what that means is that it's possible by the group dynamics and the group structure that's been set up for an individual to leech without contributing back. So what that means is that if that situation arises, then it's not an indication of a problem with that person. It's an indication of the problem of the systems of the group and how the group works.
Of course. Right, but that again is a description of a group, an individual out of balance, relationship out of balance. That was sort of my point.
Yes,
you're talking about a dysfunction, right?
Yes.
If there's no dysfunction, then it's always in the appropriate balance, right? Or it always seeks the appropriate balance.
I guess maybe what I'm trying to do is articulate balance more than just say balance, because that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's good clarification, good amplification. But the gist of my point is that the individual has in the correct balance. The individual has the appropriate power, if you will, for retaining his or her own identity, and then the shared identity in the group as well. Right, there is no continual dysfunction. Right, now that doesn't mean there's not.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I
was going to say. I mean, there's always the ebb and flow, right? But there's no continual dysfunction that's totally one way or the other. And to your point, if it's out of balance for the group, then there's some dysfunction in the group dynamics, the group rules, the group charter or whatever terminology you want to use, or the other way, it becomes the individual is suffering from that and not in the appropriate balance for their psyche, if you will.
Right, which is why there always must be a system to check that balance inside the group, right? To make sure. And the way that the only way that can be assessed, and I mean this is going to sound wild maybe, but the only way that can be assessed is at the level of each individual. And that each individual has to say, is this group in balance? No, I'm gone. Is this group in balance? Yes. Or is this group in balance? No, I need to recommend this course of action for the group to make this change. No, you don't want to make that change? Okay, I'm gone. I need to leave. The problem is, and that's the problem, is that we have a lot of groups in our society right now that are impossible to leave.
Bullseye. I think you hit the perception of it's impossible to leave. Right.
I know. I think some are literally impossible to leave.
Yes, agreed. I believe that some are, but I'm just saying even just the perception that it's impossible to leave has the power of control over some individuals.
Correct.
I mean, and in reality, there are some groups where that it is psychologically impossible to leave. I mean, if not physically impossible, right? There's the psychological, and then there's those that it's the perception, right? That they perceive it, but they're not tied. They could move or leave and depart or withdraw at any point in time. They just don't feel that they have that, right? And then I guess that's sort of the bleeding into the psychological power as well. I think where we started from, where we ended on our last conversation, where we started this one, I think this is sort of a bullseye moment, at least in my estimation, because if we take this and say, let's look at what's going on in the United States today, Does it seem like that makes sense in application across the board? I'm not trying to pick left, right, up, down, but just across the board. I think there appears to be more of this selfish control and influence from leaders to create pressure from the group and create this psychological grouping and support that they say, this is how it is, this is the reality, at the expense of the individual, right? And they're saying, this is how you should believe and feel because this is how the group believes and feels and behaves. And so you should too, because you're part of this group. No, you must. And we're seeing, and this is on all fronts on the spectrum, that we're seeing where there's a lot of conflict emanating from that, but it's not intra-group, it is intergroup where that's the case. You look at the conflict that's happening between these extremist groups going on now in the United States. And I believe there's a lot of that dynamic happening. There's this, I'm not thinking for myself. I'm holding on to this particular point because it seems to reflect what I believe to be truth. And so everything else that is connected to it must be truth too, without discernment at the individual level. And I think that is a high risk scenario that we're seeing acted out on a daily basis.
I think that I have a slightly, well, I won't say slightly, I have a different perspective than you do. I understand why you have that view, and I'm not trying to say that it's wrong. I think I want to maybe speak a little more in a slightly different direction, but kind of overlaps with what you're talking about, to tell you what I see. I see the that there is an agenda, and that agenda is drilling down through the narrative to using framing that is stating and reinforcing and stating and reinforcing and stating and reinforcing the idea that certain groups exist that don't exist, and trying to create the psychological understanding, perception, emotionalization that those groups exist, and trying to impel action based on the inclusion or exclusion from those groups. And I think it's all a fabrication. And I think that they're doing that in a way to hijack human psychology and human emotions, to take advantage of people who want to do the right thing, take advantage of people who want to do good, who want to be good. And in my perception, that's like almost everybody. Almost everybody wants to be a good person, wants to do the right things. Mm-hmm. And they're hijacking that nature of humans by making them believe that they are either de facto parts of these invisible made-up groups, or that they should want to be part of these invisible made-up groups, or be part of some other group even that does exist. And if they don't, then they're going to be excluded, because that means that they're not being a good person, and they're not trying to support good people and innocent people and people who need their help.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way to couch, that perspective, that point of view. The question it raises in my mind, though, what's the real difference between these perceived groups that you talked about, the non-existent, and those that exist? In your mind, what is the difference between those two types of groups? Because
great question. In the absence of this agenda, narrative, and framing, it's not a group that forms because it's not beneficial, does not help, does not support anything. There's no purpose behind it. It's fabricated only for a point for leverage for the agenda.
So it's a what you're saying is that you think your belief or observation or you surmise that these are not true groups in the sense of what we've been describing up to this point, that people elect to come together for whatever reasons.
Yeah.
These are fabricated conceptual groups that if we've created this group, we talk about it in such a way that we go, hey, you're like us, you're part of this, you feel like this, and then they sort of create this connection, if you will, because they got to make a connection of some sort.
Sure.
So they make this connection, and then they begin to manipulate the nefarious, the negative leadership. They seize leadership of something by creating the concept of something.
And these fabricated groups are the kinds of groups that you can't leave. They when they make those connections and pull people into those groups psychologically and emotionally, they're the kinds of groups that there's no way to leave them.
Well, there's nothing to leave from, if you think about it.
Not only that, but not only that, the basis for these groups are, it's obvious you can't leave them, and because of that makes it an even stronger pull and anchor into them.
So what you're saying is it's not just a manipulation of a group by a leader. It is the manipulation of the psyche of people.
Yes.
Using the group concept.
Yes. Exactly.
That's pretty cool thought. I mean, I've never considered it like that, and never. But that actually makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense that it's reflective of. And again, it goes back to what we said about the risks of a negative, someone in a leadership position that has negative objectives, right? And selfish objectives that, and basically they spun the model just a little bit. And instead of being part of a group that they did this with, they fabricated a group. What you're saying is they fabricate these groups and then convince people they're part of it.
Right.
They don't even solicit them. They just convince them they're part of it.
What this is this is happening. I mean, there's like, I
can see that. Yeah.
You can find like writings, like personal writings, books, but I mean, books are sometimes less believable because they can be like planted and stuff like that. But there's like verifiable writings that people have been thinking in this way about trying to do this sort of thing for decades and decades at this point. I mean, literally what this is global scale social engineering.
So yeah, and so down to brass tacks, human behavior. It's somebody whipping others up into a frenzy without real, full, accurate justification.
Ultimately, that's what it comes down to, and that's how I think
right.
that's the catalyst to start some change that
right.
this process is trying to work toward. But the whole and that's how other people see it, right? That's the only visible part of it, really. Everything else is subtle and hard to see and hard to understand and hard to trace.
It makes me think of something on the more constructive side, the parallel of what you just described, of that scenario in a positive sense. Again, going back to my sociology and psychology studies of yesteryear, there's this sociological concept, and it's existed for a long time, but it's applicable in so many different ways, especially in the sociology realm. There's the groups of the haves and the have-nots, and history has proven that the haves tend to be in power, have the riches, and that group tends to get smaller and smaller because there's less to take it from, so that the haves concentrate the power, and in the have-nots they basically concentrate the majority, the people, right? And the haves tend to get a bellyful, and then they rise up and they overthrow the
have-nots. The bellyful.
Right, the have-nots have the bellyful, and they rise up and rebel against the haves, and there's been a cycle of that just over history, right? And so when we sort of look at that sort of as a balancing and equilibrium over civilization over time. I'm not necessarily defending it per se, but we don't look at that as a manipulation. But that's truly what happens. The only way that
but that's not what's happening now. It's different now, and this is
no, I understand. That's my point though is that the have-nots, they basically it only begins when someone realizes. This is the positive aspect of compared to what's described on the negative side. The someone realizes that we can do something about this,
right?
And then they enroll others, and then this group doesn't exist. They make it exist. And then they conscript people in and solicit people in, and then they buy in, and it causes action.
But here, this is what ties back into a lot of the previous things I've said about saving the world. That wake up moment you're talking about now is never going to work ever again. And let me describe why. What you're talking about is true and definitely traceable throughout history for probably, well, not eons, but as far as we can trace throughout history in human society. So definitely that's undeniable. What's happening now is the haves we're so advanced as humans. The haves are so smart now. What they're doing is they're dividing the have-nots, and they're getting the have-nots to go at each other. So they're creating the perception that one group of the have-nots is the haves, and the others are the have-nots, and they're having them fight it out while the haves are just completely separated from that whole fray, right?
I see that. I clearly see that
it's
that
divide and conquer.
Sure.
So I mean,
Wow.
that's the real problem is that it's all ghosts. So it can happen forever, because all you have to do is conquer the one ghost or boogeyman. It's all boogeyman, right? You conquer the one boogeyman, and you just create another boogeyman. You just keep creating new boogeymen.
So this ties back to the individual aspect of what we're talking about in the dynamics of groups. And we talked last time about people abdicating their ability or their capability or their right, if you will, to think and discern for themselves, and they follow the group without thinking, without any discerning,
because it's easier.
It's easier, and it's their belief that that's what their protection, their safety, their connection, their affiliation is all based on that. If I push back, I put that at risk.
Yep.
Right. But what they don't realize in certain scenarios, if you don't push back, that's an even bigger risk.
There's like no short term and really no medium term negative ramifications from going down that path. But the long term ramifications are absolutely fatal. And it's just the opposite to take the other approach. It's nearly fatal to take the opposite approach in the short to medium term, but you get past that, and then it's like it's
Nirvana,
the heaven,
utopia.
right?
Yeah, right. So that's pretty powerful. I mean, we've here in just a half an hour to 45 minutes, we've decomposed some dynamics of social psychology and kind of encapsulated them. Or I don't say encapsulate, it's not really true, but we've described them in a pretty fundamental way, I think, and it seems to, number one, align with history, right? It's not in conflict with history, and it also seems to align with present, right? With what's happening, which we perceive as happening or believe is happening, right? I mean, obviously, we only know what we know. But you can draw a whole lot about what you don't know, or what you think you don't know, from what you do know.
Sure.
But we don't know what we don't know. Of course, there's that whole round of things there. But in reality, I think what we are seeing, and seeing from a not too far arm's length distance, is that what you've described and what you've said is happening is certainly a very likely accurate description of what's happening in the world today, and especially in this country. And I'm sure it's happening in the United States, and I'm sure it's happening in other countries as well.
All around the world.
Yeah. So, as an individual, how do we exist and thrive? Right? Maybe Maybe that's a good. I mean, you never got to your second point. You know that
That's true. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget
it. And maybe since we've kind of got this one to a good spot, we'll stop and pick up on your second point at the next time we get together.
I think that'd be good. Yeah.
But I mean, I think, and then associated with that second point is the question of and it sort of gets into more something you've alluded to in the past too, talking about our personal views and philosophies and approaches to life, and to all the things surrounding life that affect and influence, number one, how we think, but then how we act, how we believe, and how we expect, right? Because a lot of these things, I think, lead to expectations that as individuals we can have about the existence that we have and those around.
Sure.
I'm not saying we can't mandate. I don't mean that, but I mean just, that there's this reciprocity of values and behavior, right? That need to coexist, and those are the expectations I'm talking about.
And I think that talking about all the other things that you're speaking of, particularly with values and just kind of what drives you day to day. This next point that we'll get to next week is where the rubber meets the road on why that matters, because it's super important, and it is so critically important, and it is one of the most, I think, undervalued and misunderstood things about life, about why things like that are so important, and it's so minimized, and I can't wrap my head around why it's so minimized.
Well, I think that speaks to the other point about especially how you and I think um, uh, differently individually than the greater population, I think. And I mean, there are others that feel and think like us in that regard. I don't mean necessarily politically aligned. I'm not referring to that, but I'm just talking about from a personal psychology and social psychology perspective.
Yeah.
You volunteered, that you wanted to be an R and have chosen to be unique for a lot of reasons, a lot of good reasons, a lot of positive reasons. And I have been in that vein to some extent as well. I think you have a stronger lean that way for a lot of really good reasons than I've had. Partly is generational, certainly.
Yeah.
Because you and I are certainly not in the same generation. But I think from a
Package
value
deal.
perspective, I don't know. Your gray beard is starting to give you away. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm the one with the gray beard. But I think that's something that should be something that should help us demonstrate a connection across the generations, right? Rather than a separation across the generations, which I think there seems to be some of that either intentionally or unintentionally happening, or trying to be made to happen. This separation, right? This whole thing about in the political realm, the millennials, right, trying to pull them, in one direction or another, the conservatives and the liberals and all that kind of stuff.
I think this is a good topic for another podcast, because I think I'm a little more optimistic. I may be a little more optimistic about that than you are, and I would like to talk about that.
I've heard some of that, and I'm anxious to hear more, because I think that's something a baby boomer could really get some good encouragement from.
Sure.
Yeah, that being the case. So, all right. I'm empty. I'm done. I've had a great time as always. It's been a pleasure. This has been one that I think is getting much closer to the heart of some points and topics that we've been pushing toward for a long, long time. And I'm looking forward to the next ones.
Same here, man. I appreciate you taking the time, Doyle.
Indeed. My pleasure.
All right. We'll talk to you next time.
Until later.
All right. See ya.
See ya.